let's talk about last year's Texans and sort of why this happened, right? It's easy now to think of the Texans as what we know them. CJ Stroud is electric. He's got, he's out there in a bunch of shows. He's given his opinions, some of which seem to really piss people off. That's fine. People don't like his Matthew Stafford would have won multiple Super Bowls with Aaron Rodgers take. Okay, who cares? Great quarterback. D'Amico Ryan's great coach. Houston's one of these up-and-coming teams that could potentially, maybe give the Chiefs a run for their money in the AFC. But 365 days ago, Dalton, nobody was talking about them like that. They were picking second overall to get CJ Stroud for a reason. Okay, this was a team that was in trouble. But Stroud comes in, he has that immediate success. To you, when you think of last year's Texans, why did it work out so quickly and so well?
Stroud knows ball. He likes Pearsall, and
yes.
and he told Parsons that there's no way you're hitting 250 in Major League Baseball. That made the rounds too, that Parsons is delusional and thinks he can hit Major League pitching.
Yeah.
But
great point, Dalton. How is it that Stroud is getting, because I've reposted a couple of like his Nico Collins quotes, of course, and people are like, yeah, well, every time he talks, he's just talking out of his ass. You watch those two on screen together and you think Stroud is the one who's talking out of his ass? Micah Parsons, come back to us, please.
Yeah, Tyler Glasnow entered into the chat, and he's like 5 hits at best and 500 at bats. But you probably don't even know who Glasnow is. But we'll move on from the baseball talk. How it worked was just talent. I like the the coaching help with Houston, but you add CJ Stroud, who's one of the 3 most valuable players in the NFL right now if you were starting a draft. So you got your superstar at the most important position, and with these talented receivers, you were in on Nico Collins before he broke out. I'll throw a curveball at you and say I have Tank Dell ranked right there with Nico. You look at the stats when they were on the field together, target share, target per route run, all similar, except the air yard share, Dell dominates. Obviously, he suffered some injuries that we need to pay attention to. Scott Barrett has a new secret stat called average separation score, and Dell's number 1. Diggs has fallen. It's year 10, man. I have Diggs comfortably behind Dell and Collins in my fantasy rankings, and I think that it's going to be more of the same for them as far as fantasy. It's a great setup. Obviously, we'd love 2 receivers instead of 3, spreading the wealth. But man, I'm all about Dell, all about Nico Collins this year, and letting others overdraft Diggs at that age.
I'm glad you said that talent is the big reason here, because we can talk about. Well, I think there's a real football conversation and a fantasy conversation, because I think when you're talking about why are the Texans this good this quickly, we have to mention that D'Amico Ryans is just one of those guys, right? Like, he is the big C word, culture setter. That has been very apparent. Not everybody could come into that organization that had 2 head coaches in 2 years fired, it was like trying to talk to Josh McCown, who's never coached in the league, for a single second, trying to make him their head coach. They don't end up making him the head coach because of the whole Brian Flores lawsuit. You can't do that. And at that point, they had a freaking, Jack Easterby problem. Like the team chaplain was like running football operation at one point. It was an outright mess. The whole Deshaun Watson thing kind of clouding the Houston Texans during this time. Not everybody can come into that building and just immediately turn them into a contender. That is a head coach thing. Talent, absolutely, but that is part of it. I think that when we talk about these other teams, having some faith in the guy at the top of the list is like the top of the food chain. That has to be, to me, a non-negotiable. We have to believe that is the case. Secondly, though, like from an offensive standpoint and a fantasy standpoint, it is talent, because I've said this a lot recently. I like Bobby Slowick, but I think he's kind of gotten sort of maybe overrated as like a scheme guy, just running a pretty typical Shanahan offense. But doing that with these guys worked so well, Dalton, because when I was kind of rethinking the Texans and marinating on these guys, to me, what I come back to, especially with these 3, Stroud, Nico, and Dell, is just a fundamental misunderstanding of how good these guys were. With Nico Collins, people know how I felt about Nico coming into the year, that he was at least on film, throw out the stats in that goofball offense with Davis Mills and all that stuff. On film, he was at least a viable starting NFL X receiver. Like in reception perception profile as an above average starting NFL X receiver. He took his game to another level, obviously, this past year. Tank Dell, you mentioned he was great as a rookie. he was great in college. He was great as a separator. I don't know what the Scott Barrett, the fantasy point stat is at this point yet, but like, yeah, I mean, even just back in, you look at him on film, he was a great separator. He had some holes in his game. He still, I think, has some holes in his game, but just a good player that had he been 190 pounds instead of 165 or whatever, he would have gone a lot higher. And CJ Stroud, I think, the NFL consensus kind of underrated how good of a quarterback prospect he was. So to me, I think that's another part of this that is a non-negotiable. There has to be existing players on here that I think people don't quite kind of have it wrapped around their mind yet, just how good these guys are.
Yeah, your reception perception, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's very bullish on Dell as well. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on Diggs. I just feel like a new system, 10th year in the league, veteran. I know he's previously an alpha, but it feels to me like he'll be third fiddle here. And if you look at just his history, again, 10th year in the league, wide receiver, production does start to drop there. And Jacob Gibbs has a tweet out there saying that his yards per target on deep targets fell off a cliff last year, and the accuracy of those targets and the percentage of those targets exactly the same as they were the 3 years prior. So maybe he is, falling off just a little there. I'm talking both ways there, though, because I'm also pointing out Josh Allen's splits with and without him. So like, he's going to really miss Diggs. But the truth is maybe Diggs faded a little last year. But anyway, all I'm saying is I can't see possibly drafting Diggs over Dell. I mean, in the market right now, that's the way it is. But you're a big Diggs guy, so I'd love to hear, your thoughts because you like them all. So talk some sense into me, Harmon.
No, I actually think both of those things can be true, that Josh Allen is going to miss Stephon Diggs and that Stephon Diggs is a declining player, because that was the case last year. Now, I think the Bills are doing a whole separate conversation, but I think the Bills are trying to piece together that receiver room, and we'll see how that plays out. But I do think you can say, yeah, he's going to miss what Diggs was. But maybe Diggs is still a declining player here, because to me, like you mentioned that Jacob Gibbs stat, that's exactly what is sort of illuminated via his reception perception, is that still a really good separator short and underneath, but those deep route success rates are coming down. He's not separating against press man coverage on those vertical routes like he used to. Still, like if you look at his overall success rates, you look at just kind of his profile holistically, it still looks like an above average, good, normal NFL receiver, but Stephon Diggs is not a normal NFL receiver. He was one of the top 5, top 3 elite receivers in the league prior to last year. I think he took a step back from that. So I think if you're looking, to me, the one thing I think pretty clearly about the Houston Texans receivers, and I just wrote a piece on this, kind of like take shopping this out for the website so people can go read that. The one thing I clearly believe is that Nico Collins is the one here. I know like people will point out the stats with him and Tank Dell. I just think when you project forward, I'm going to bet on the guy that has that size, that profile as an X receiver, who runs routes that way, who separates at, last year at truly an elite level against press man coverage. And then you look at Dell, I think very good player. I haven't done, I have rankings out, but I haven't really like hard and fast rankings, anything like that. I absolutely think it's plausible that it could go Collins, Dell, Diggs, because I think Diggs' role, I kind of want to see where they're going to end up playing him. Like, is he a flanker for them, or is Dell the flanker? Is Dell the slot, or is Diggs the slot? I think that's going to end up sort of kind of helping us unlock the pecking order here, if that makes sense.
And one final note we absolutely should mention before we move up to Texans is I complained about in this podcast last year, so I'm glad the stats bore it out. Houston was 19th in pass rate over expectation and 22nd in first down throw rate. I get it. It was a rookie quarterback, but they had horrible success running the ball. So Stroud did what he did as a rookie. It's easy to forget he suffered multiple concussions. Only maybe one was reported. True. He was all messed up there. And horrible situations, playing from 2nd and 11, 2nd and 10, throwing in obvious downs constantly. So this guy's the real deal. And now he has, no matter how, even if faded a little, Diggs to go along with Dell year 2 and Collins. Oh boy. I mean, that's the setup that's a championship caliber offense, no question. That's why 100%. Joe Mixon suddenly I'm interested in fantasy again,
Yeah, that running game this year is going to be really interesting to track, right? Because that was, looking back at last year's Texans, people thought Dameon Pierce, he was drafted obviously way ahead of any of these guys. He was the first Texans player off the board, and he was not even worth a roster spot very quickly into the season. He was one of the worst draft picks you could possibly make, and a lot of that was because he didn't fit the system. I wish I'd put more credence into that from a lot of the stuff I said on last year's pod. I definitely ended up drafting him in too many places. Bad draft pick for sure. But because now they have a veteran guy who can probably run some more of those zone concepts. That's great. But I also think the acquisition of Diggs just points to this team is going to throw the ball a lot more. Like I will be stunned if they throw the ball at the rate that they did last year. And that goes also for, people kind of look at, well, Nico Collins was rotating off and on the field. Tank Dell was rotating off and on the field. I think someone asked me about this, like, why is Nico like at a 68% snap rate for the season? If he's anything close to that, if he's not, I'll eat the tweet that I said is what I said. I will eat a tweet if he is not well north of 68%. What happened last year, like the Texans didn't even expect themselves to be this good. Now, all their actions this year, acquiring a veteran running back, acquiring Diggs, obviously is the bigger one. They expect themselves to be much better this year. And just last point on last year's Texans before we move on, what I said about the fundamental understanding of how good this team was, that really extends to the offensive line, because it was a banged up group throughout the course of the season, but going into the year, they had several critical offensive line like spots locked up, most notably Laramie Tunsil at left tackle. And you just juxtapose what CJ Stroud was playing with what Bryce Young was playing with. It's a big reason beyond just the individual players why one season went the way that it did.
And that'll be a fun division with potential shootouts, Colts games indoors. The Titans, all they want to do is throw, no defense. Jacksonville's solid D, but could be a fun one. Just really quickly, Dameon Pierce getting hyped by the coaches, saying he put in the work this off season, but does he still a horrible match for that offense? Because with Mixon and no one else there, I mean, there's obvious upside if Pierce suddenly plays like he did 2 years ago and he put in this dedicated work. He's someone to not have completely off your radar, is what I'll say, given this offense's upside.
Yeah, he could also be maybe an interesting trade candidate too. Some team like Dallas wants to kick the tires on a younger back. That's a part of the reason why they're saying what they're saying. But I agree that not somebody to totally give up on, because clearly he can play. Like we saw his rookie season, he can play in the NFL at some level. So maybe we haven't heard the last of Dameon Pierce, but probably for the rest of fantasy preseason, you've heard the last of Dameon Pierce.